10 reasons Christians ought to tithe. Reason number 8, because Christ is our Passover. You may recall that about 8 weeks ago, on what happened to be Easter Sunday morning, I brought you a lesson about the observation of Easter entitled Pagan Schmagan. And in that lesson, I disputed the oft-repeated criticism of Easter, the charge that Easter is pagan in origin. And what I showed you in that lesson is that that charge is really completely false, because though we're fond of pointing out in our tradition that the early church partook of the Lord's Supper every Sunday morning in celebration and rehearsal of the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ, they also, from the very beginning, observed the remembrance of the actual passion of Christ, which many of them, the first Christians, had witnessed with their own eyes. And they made this celebration on an annual basis in their celebration of the Passover. And we know this not just from church history, but from the Bible itself. I mean, after all, what is Easter? I mean, at its core, at its base, what is Easter fundamentally? Well, Easter is an annual celebration of the Passion, an annual celebration of the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ, which celebration clearly, according to the Bible, originated in the early church and by divine command has been continued in the church ever since. Only in the early church, they didn't call this annual celebration Easter. Of course not. They didn't speak English back then. They had another name for it. They didn't call it Easter. They called it Passover. At the Last Supper, which was a Passover meal, Jesus transformed the Passover from being a Jewish celebration to being a Christian celebration. He did this by bringing certain elements of this old covenant meal, the bread and the wine, to bear on the new covenant. And the language that he used to do so couldn't have been more clearly enunciated. Luke 22:19-20, and he took bread, and when he had gracified it, he broke it and gave it to them, saying, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And likewise the cup after they had eaten, saying, "This cup that is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood." And in his account of that event, Paul in 1 Corinthians 11:25 gives us a longer quote from that night. In the same way also he took the cup after supper, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me." Well, to what cup was Jesus referring when he said, "this cup"? Well, the Passover cup. And what did he mean when he said, "as often as you drink it"? Well, how often did the Jews drink from the Passover cup? Well, once a year, every year, a Passover. And to what was Jesus referring when he said, "do this in remembrance of me"? Well, do what? Well, eat the Passover meal, and with the meal, eat and drink what is now the Lord's Supper. Now, it's clear from several passages in the book of Acts that the early church was partaking of the Lord's Supper every time they met together, and most certainly on the first day of the week, every week. But if I understand Matthew 26 and Mark 14 and Luke 22 and 1 Corinthians 11 correctly, the instructions that the Lord gave at the Last Supper were that once a year, his disciples were to partake of the Lord's Supper specifically in conjunction with the Passover feast, an annual celebration of the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. Now, I could be wrong about that. That could be an erroneous interpretation of these texts, but I don't think so. And I'll tell you why. Because from that day forward, every year, for the next 300 years at least. That's exactly what the church did. Every year, they held a feast at Passover time. And at that feast, they partook of the Lord's Supper in remembrance of Jesus, just as he had commanded them. Now, in the time of Constantine, the church was actively seeking to separate itself from historical Judaism. And they began dating the anniversary of the crucifixion of Christ according to the Julian calendar, rather than the lunar calendar of biblical Judaism. And this untethered the date of what we now call Easter from the date of the Passover. But it did not change the essence of the observation. Christian Passover has continued to be observed in the church, just as was observed in the early church, once a year, every year from the beginning to the present. We see evidence of this from about 51 AD, 18 years after the Last Supper, in Acts 18:21, where Luke tells us, "But bidding them farewell, Paul said to the Ephesians, I must by all means attend this upcoming feast in Jerusalem, but I will return to you if God wills." And he set sail from Ephesus. And then about 3 years later, in 54 AD, 21 years after the Last Supper, the feast is still being observed. Acts 26, we sailed from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread. And within 5 days, we came to them at Troas, where we stayed 7 days. And that same year, in 1 Corinthians 5, 7 through 8, Paul commanded the Christians at Corinth to do the same. For Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. Therefore, let us keep the festival. Not with the old yeast of malice and wickedness, but with bread without yeast, the bread of sincerity and truth. Beloved, it seems clear to me that the biblical foundation for celebrating the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ in a conspicuous way on an annual basis is pretty much rock solid. The early church did that very thing, and they did so at the command of the Lord himself, which command was repeated by the apostles and obeyed by Christians from the very beginning to the present. Those are the origins of what we call Easter, which origins, as far as I can tell, are completely free of any pagan influence. So where did that notion come from? Where did anybody ever get the idea that Easter originated in pagan culture? Well, as far as I can tell, that idea is a product of the evolution of language, because the meanings of words changes over time as the usage of those words change. You may recall that I've told you a number of times how it is that the word conscience has a very different meaning in the Bible than it does in 21st century America. The word sunediseos, which is translated conscience, is a compound word made up of two words, ediseos, meaning knowledge, with the prefix sun, meaning together. Literally, it means knowledge shared with another. And with that usage in mind, it would have been completely appropriate 500 years ago to translate the word sunediseos with the English word conscience, because everyone knew and understood that the word conscience is also a compound word made up of two words, con, meaning with or together, and science, meaning knowledge. However, over the course of the 16th century, the meaning of shared knowledge fell by the wayside as the word conscience began to be used as a synonym for, and then a replacement for, the word inwit, which means internal knowledge. As Thomas Hobbes explains in his famous book of 1651, Leviathan, when two or more men know of one and the same fact, they are said to be conscious of it one to another. which is as much as to know it together. And because such are fittest witnesses of the facts to one another, or of a third, it was and ever will be reputed a very evil act for any man to speak against his conscience, or to corrupt or force another to do so, insomuch as the plea of conscience has been always hearkened unto very diligently in all times. Afterwards, men made use of the same word metaphorically for the knowledge of their own secret facts and secret thoughts. And therefore it is rhetorically said that the conscience is 1,000 witnesses. And last of all, men vehemently in love with their own new opinions, though never so absurd, and obstinately bent to maintain them, gave those, their opinions, also that reverenced name of conscience, as if they would have it seem unlawful to change or speak against them, and so pretend to know that they are true when they know at most but that they think so. Thus, it appears that the usage of the word conscience to refer to one's inward thoughts is a relatively recent development. Classically speaking, the word conscience refers to knowledge shared with another. As such, one's duty to conscience is not fidelity to yourself, but fidelity to that which is known communally. Not only that, but it has been classically understood that the knowledge to which conscience testifies is common not first and foremost to one's fellow man, but first and foremost to God. Because the implied knower in the conscience equation has always been God. So that according to the Oxford English Dictionary, even when a matter is purely internal, the force of conscience is understood not in terms of the ethical self, but in terms of this deity in my bosom. Now, that is quite a shift in meaning. Because 500 years ago, if you told someone that you were bound by your conscience, they would have understood you to mean that you were bound by your inner self, as held in check by God. But now, if you say that you're bound by your conscience, all that means is that you're bound by your inner self, which is held in check by itself. And that's a distinction with a difference. But that's how it is that the meaning of words change over time and the usage of those words change. Well, that's what happened with the word Easter. You see, the first Christians arrived in the British Isles before the end of the first century. But Christianity didn't take hold there till very late in the 6th century, when Augustine of Hippo journeyed there at the behest of Pope Gregory the Great to teach biblical Christianity to the Anglo-Saxons aright. But in the meantime, for the first 500 years that Christianity existed in Britain, it was but one of many religions practiced in that region, and it was practiced in the shadows of a predominantly pagan culture, a culture that was awash with a mixture of ancient Greek, Roman, Nordic, Germanic, and Celtic mythology and worship practices. But the Christians who lived in Britain at the time had the integrity to keep their faith alive. And they knew enough about their own faith that they had internalized the Old Testament. They knew what Passover was. They recognized what it meant and understood that as Christians, Christ was their Passover. And in keeping with the practices of the church at its purest in the Middle East, some 2,500 miles away, they understood that in addition to partaking of the Lord's Supper every Sunday morning, they were to commemorate the Passion of Christ in a conspicuous way on an annual basis every year at Passover time, just as the rest of the church was doing, which they did faithfully, despite the pressures of living in a predominantly pagan culture with numerous competing gods and worship practices, one of which involved the worship of a minor Western Germanic goddess named Ustra. who was popular among the Celtic Britons in Northumberland County in England. She was a very localized goddess with a very small appeal. But for a period of about 200 years, from 350 to 550 AD, the locals there worshipped her for 1 month out of the year, the fourth month, which would be April to us, but which they called Ooster month, the month having been named for Oostra. And the Christians living in that culture, lacking the wherewithal to change the names of the months, often referred to their celebrations of the Christian Passover season, which took place most often in the fourth month of the year, as the celebrations of Oostra, which was short for Ooster month. Now that's something that we ought to be able to relate to. After all, the names of January, February, March, May, and June all have pagan origins, and I've never seen any Christian campaign to have them changed. Well, in 731 AD, the Venerable Bede, a monk who lived in Northumbria, wrote a book entitled Ecclesiastical History of the English People, in which he made mention of this. Now, the book was 400 pages in length, and the Bede dedicated only about 3 sentences to this topic. But for some reason, that is the part of the book that captured the popular imagination. And the usage of the word Ooster to refer to the Christian observation of the Passover spread like wildfire. But, and this is very important, this happened only where English and other Germanic languages were spoken. Christian Passover is called Easter only in a handful of languages. Now, it turns out that one of those languages has become the lingua franca. English has become the international trade language of the world, but the rest of the world has always and only referred to the annual celebration of the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ as Passover. Nothing from the mythology of Ooster was ever carried over into Easter. Only her name survives, which, by the way, the name is hers and hers alone. The English word Easter has no etymological connections to Ishtar or Ashtaroth, either one. And the Easter bunny and Easter candy, Easter eggs, those are late additions to the holiday, both coming to us by way of Germany, and neither one has had any serious impact on the Christian celebration of Easter. Beloved, there's nothing pagan about Easter, and there never has been. Christ is our Passover. And the fact that most of the professing Christians in the world proclaim at least once a year that Christ is our Passover in the fourth month of the year, I think is amazing. And the way that Christ is acknowledged as the Passover of the new covenant is through the ceremonial eating of his body and drinking of his blood through participation in the Lord's Supper. Which is why many churches have traditionally served the Lord's Supper once a year and once a year only, because of its biblical association with Passover. Now, in our tradition, we have found the biblical evidence that the early church partook of the Lord's Supper every Sunday to be very compelling. And accordingly, we serve the Lord's Supper every Lord's Day. We partake of the Lord's Supper every Sunday morning. Now, traditionally, when we have finished participating in the Lord's Supper as part of our Sunday morning worship service, we then move directly to the next element of our service, which is the collection. However, we've been very clear in our teaching that while the communion and the collection are both vital acts of worship, they're not connected to each other theologically. That is, even though we always take the collection immediately after partaking of the Lord's Supper, one does not follow from the other. But today I want to propose to you that the collection is to be associated directly with the communion. And the reason for that is precisely because Christ is our Passover. And the proper response to the Passover is giving. In Exodus 12, 1 through 14, we have the record of the instructions that the Lord gave to Moses for the people to follow in regard to the first Passover. That in each household they were to select a lamb, which they would keep with them from the 10th of Nisan to the 14th. And the implication of Exodus 12:6 is that the lamb would be kept in the house with the family for those 5 days, just long enough for the family to become attached to the animal, as though it were a pet. That is, he will dwell among his people, just as the Word made flesh, according to John 1:14, dwelt among us. Then on the 14th of the month at sunset, the lamb is to be slaughtered, its blood captured in a vessel and sprinkled on the mantle of the doorframe of the house with a sprig of hyssop. And then the Lord, when he passes through the land to take what is his, the firstborn of every womb of both man and beast, will come and take what is his. But when the Lord sees the blood upon the mantle of the doorframe, he will pass over that house and leave the firstborn untouched. And when you read through that passage, it's easy to see how it is that under the new covenant, Christ is our Passover. And it's also easy to see how it is that Christ, as our Passover, is presented to us in the Lord's Supper. Because just as the Passover lamb was eaten by the children of Israel to give them strength for their journey, so we eat of the body of Christ to give us strength for our journey. Now, the correspondence between Christ and the Passover lamb is qualified, as is the correspondence between Christ and every type of Christ in the Old Covenant. There are no types of Christ in the Old Testament which, on their own, correspond with every element of the New Covenant, or even every element of the Lord's Supper. After all, for instance, there are no types of Christ in the Old Testament that involve the drinking of blood. And the Bible tells us why that is. Because life is in the blood. And anyone who takes lifeblood into his own body has fellowship with that life that he takes into himself. But the correspondence between Christ and the Passover lamb is every bit as strong as the correspondence between Christ and the victim for sin on the Day of Atonement, along with many other types and shadows of Christ in the Old Testament, which is why Paul is able to declare with no sense of irony whatsoever in 1 Corinthians 5:7 that Christ is our Passover lamb. For we, like the children of Israel in the Exodus, have been spared death because of the blood spilled by our Passover lamb. But here's the thing. Because while we do well to make that connection and to be mindful of it whenever we partake of the Lord's Supper, we tend to make the connection, feel good about it, and leave it at that. But the Passover feast doesn't take place in a vacuum. It takes place in the context of an historical event that has a lot of moving parts. Remember, the Lord commanded the Israelites to partake of this meal in haste, with their sandals strapped and their staves in hand, being ready to leave at a moment's notice, because they had quite the journey ahead of them and much of the Lord's business to be about. And they had to be ready to receive their marching orders. But the orders they received weren't just to march. It wasn't just, good job, you made a happy plate. Now, off you go. Head out of town, and when you reach the city gates, head northeast. We'll all rendezvous when we get to Canaan. No, there was much more to it than that. Remember what God promised Abraham? How it was that just before God swore by his own existence, when he passed between the carcass halves in Genesis 15, that he said to Abraham, Abram, I want you to know and know with absolute certainty that your descendants will be sojourners in a foreign country, The citizens there will enslave and oppress them for 400 years. But I will bring the nation that enslaves them to judgment. After that, they will leave free and rich. And God kept that promise. It had been 400 some odd years since Joseph sold his brethren into slavery to Pharaoh. And now it was time for them all to leave Egypt as free people. But they weren't just supposed to be free, they were supposed to be free and rich. And God fulfilled that promise in verses 35 and 36 of Exodus 12. The children of Israel did as Moses had told them, and asked the Egyptians for gifts of clothing and gold and silver jewelry. The Lord had given the people such prestige in the eyes of the Egyptians that they gave them whatever they asked. Thus, they took the Egyptians for all they had. So after the Israelites had eaten the Passover and had left their homes, but before they had a chance to leave their own neighborhoods, God did something quite remarkable. He prospered them. He blessed them with the financial means that they would need to be the people that he intended them to be. And when he blessed them, he didn't just leave his blessing at that. He didn't make them free and rich and then just send them off to the east to do as they pleased. No, the record of the Exodus doesn't end with chapter 12 of the book of Exodus. The gifts that God gave to the people, the gift of being spared death, the gift of their freedom, the gift of the riches of the Egyptians, were free gifts indeed. That is, they were free on the front end. The Hebrews did nothing to earn those gifts except to be the descendants of Abraham. These gifts were free in that they were unearned, just as our salvation is free in that it is unearned. But just as with our salvation, the gifts that God gave to the children of Israel came with a cost. When Moses came to Pharaoh and quoted the Lord, commanding him to free his people, what did he say? I mean, you know the line, don't you? Moses said to Pharaoh, "Thus says the Lord, let my people go." Right? Well, not exactly right. Yes, he did say that, but that isn't all he said. That isn't the line that God gave him. At no point does God ever say to Pharaoh, "Let my people go," and then leave it at that. No, rather what he says no fewer than 6 times in Exodus 7 through 10 is, "Let my people go that they may serve me." In Exodus 12, God gives his people their lives, their freedom from slavery, all the liquid assets of their oppressors, a leader to follow, and he points them in the general direction that they should go. But then we turn the page from Exodus 12 to Exodus 13, and we find the following. The Lord said to Moses, "Consecrate to me all the firstborn." Whatever is the first to open the womb among the people of Israel, both of man and of beast, is mine. Then Moses said to the people, "Remember this day in which you came out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, for by a strong hand the Lord brought you out of this place. No leavened bread shall be eaten. Today in the month of Abib you're going out. And when the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites, which he swore to your fathers to give you, a land flowing with milk and honey, you shall keep this service in this month. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, and on the 7th day there shall be a feast unto the Lord. You shall tell your sons on that day, it is because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt. This observance shall be for you like a sign on your hand and a symbol on your forehead, that this law of the Lord is to be on your lips. For the Lord brought you out of Egypt with his mighty hand. You shall therefore keep this statute at its appointed time from year to year. When the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites, as he swore to you and your fathers, and shall give it to you, you shall set apart to the Lord all that first opens the womb. All the firstborn of your animals that are males shall be the Lord's, every firstborn of a donkey, you shall redeem with a lamb. Or if you will not redeem it, you shall break its neck. Every firstborn of man among your sons you shall redeem. And when in time to come your sons ask you, what does this mean? You shall say to him, by a strong hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. The night of the Exodus, before the sun had even risen, while it was still dark outside, and the Israelites were just getting underway on their journey, God came to Moses and said, tell the people that this is what freedom looks like. Tell them that because I have given them what I have given them, I am their Lord, and they are my people, and they will do as I command them. And what I command them is that everything that was bought for them by the blood of the Passover lamb now belongs to me. These lives are consecrated to me. I command them to be voluntarily undertaken, that they acknowledge this by consecrating these lives to me themselves. And then I command them to redeem these lives by paying a redemption price for them. Now remember that when God made this demand of the people, he didn't do so to impoverish them. No, before he commanded them to give, he first gave to them. And what he gave to them was their lives, their livelihoods, and the means to continue them both. And what he commanded them to give to him in return was the redemption price, commensurate with what they had received at his hand. And that brings us back to the Lord's Supper, at the celebration of the Christian Passover, with Christ as our Passover lamb, because we know that the Lord's Supper is a reconsecration of the Passover under the new covenant. According to Paul of 1 Corinthians 5:7, Christ is our Passover lamb. And according to Paul in 1 Corinthians 16:2, our giving is supposed to be commensurate with what the Lord has given us. That is, we are to give as we have been prospered. Now, what we have received from our Passover lamb is somewhat different, at least in a literal sense, from what the Israelites received from their Passover lamb. And the mechanism commanded of the Israelites for redeeming what had been consecrated to the Lord is somewhat different from what's available to us under the new covenant, because we're no longer sacrificing animals as was done under the old covenant. So what is the appropriate response? What is the appropriate gift for us to give to God in response to his having given to us of his Passover lamb? Well, this is where last week's lesson comes in, because if there's one thing we know for sure about the transaction between Abraham and Melchizedek, it's that transaction, as recorded in Genesis 14, in that transaction, when Melchizedek gave bread and wine to Abraham, that was more than a type and shadow of the Lord's Supper, because Melchizedek is more than an ordinary man. Melchizedek is an immortal priest of the heavenly tabernacle forever, with no father, no mother, no genealogy, no beginning of days, no end of days. And he was never a priest of any covenant other than the covenant of Christ. Melchizedek, as a representative of Christ, served bread and wine to Abraham. A priest of the covenant of Christ served bread and wine to Abraham on the king's dale in Genesis 14. Beloved, essentially, and I mean that literally, by its essence, in its essence, what Melchizedek served to Abraham on the king's dale 2,000 years before Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper at the Last Supper was the Lord's Supper. And Abraham responded to this gift of the Passover lamb of the new covenant by rendering unto Melchizedek a tithe. of all that he had. And we know that that's the appropriate amount to give under the new covenant, because that's the standard that's commended to the church in Hebrews 5 through 9. 10 reasons why Christians ought to tithe. Reason number 1, because giving in general and giving according to God's expectations in particular are woven into the warp and woof of the fabric of the Word of God from the beginning to the end. Reason number 2, because tithing is an eternal principle. Reason number 3, because the tithe belongs to the Lord. That isn't a law, that's a fact. Reason number 4, because tithing is a floor, not a ceiling. Reason number 5, because the Apostle Paul commended tithing to the church. Reason number 6, because Jesus commended tithing to his followers. Reason number 7, because Melchizedek isn't a relic of the past. He is a priest of the present. And reason number 8, because Christ is our Passover. Now, if you want to hear more about those other reasons, this is part 3 of this lesson series. You can find parts 1 and 2 online. And I'll be happy to answer any questions anyone has about those, because some of those may not sound right to you. You may not think that Paul commended tithing to the church. You may not think that Jesus commended tithing to the church. You may not think that the book of Hebrews commends tithing to the church. I guarantee you they do. And if you listen to those lessons, you'll see why I'm persuaded of that. And that brings us to reason number 9. And we'll dig into that next week. That's my lesson for today.